She was 27 years old, and she had nothing left in the world but a surveyor's satchel, a dead father's compass, and $9 in a coat pocket when the Meridian Valley Land Trust served her eviction notice on a gray Thursday morning in the spring of 1902, in the small Wyoming territorial town of Dunbar's Crossing. 3 months after her father's death had left her sole heir to a property dispute she had not known existed and could not afford to fight. Her father, Silas Cade, had spent 30 years as the territory's most meticulous railroad surveyor, and when a winter fever took him in December, the trust's attorney, a man named Prescott Hale whose patience had the particular quality of patience that has money behind it, produced documentation establishing that the 40 acres Silas had surveyed and filed on 20 years prior had been absorbed into the trust's land grant through a territorial amendment Silas had apparently never known to challenge, leaving his daughter with $9, a rented room she could afford for another 2 weeks, and a surveying kit whose instruments she could operate as well as any man in Wyoming and which no firm in Dunbar's Crossing would hire her to use. So when an elderly postmaster named Gideon Marsh mentioned, over the counter at the general store, that the trust was auctioning off a decommissioned railroad right-of-way at the territory's edge for back taxes, a 4-mile stretch of abandoned track last surveyed in 1871 and since lost to overgrowth and general forgetting, at a minimum bid of $7. Neva Cade walked to the county land office the following morning and paid $7 of her $9 for a strip of land that ended, by every official map the territory possessed, at a point where the track simply ceased to exist and beyond which, officially, there was nothing. What existed beyond the end of those tracks had not appeared on any map since before she was born, and what she found there, sealed and standing and entirely impossible by every account the territory had ever kept, would not only give Neva Cade her life back, but would finally return to Dunbar's Crossing the truth that had been walking alongside it for 30 years without anyone ever knowing to look. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Neva Cade. If you have ever followed something past the point where every sensible person told you to turn back, and found that the following was the whole point, tell us in the comments, because tonight, this story is for you. Neva had grown up learning to read the land the way most children learn to read words, as a system of marks whose meaning, once understood, told you something true and reliable about the world rather than something merely decorative. Her father, Silas Cade, had been a railroad surveyor for the Union Pacific and its successor companies for the better part of her childhood, a quiet man of extraordinary precision who moved through the world's difficult terrain with the unhurried confidence of someone who understood that the Earth's actual surface, properly measured, told a more reliable story than any document produced about it afterward. He brought Neva into the field from the time she was old enough to handle a rod without dropping it, and he taught her the work not in the formal manner of instruction but in the ambient manner of a man who simply could not encounter an interesting landscape feature without explaining, to whoever was nearby, exactly what it meant and why it mattered. She learned to read a slope's drainage the way he read it, to identify by the pattern of vegetation where water ran underground in dry seasons, to understand that a survey's value lay not in the line it drew on paper but in the accuracy with which that line corresponded to what the ground actually was, a correspondence that required, more than any other single quality, the willingness to look at what was actually there rather than at what the map already said should be there. Her mother, Clara, had died of a swift pneumonia when Neva was 14, and in the years that followed, father and daughter built the remainder of their domestic life around the surveying kit's rhythms, moving between field assignments across Wyoming and the adjacent territories as work required, making something that functioned like a permanent home out of the quality of their daily partnership rather than out of any fixed place. Clara had been, in her own quiet way, as exacting as Silas, a woman who kept accounts with the same meticulous care her husband brought to measurements, who had instilled in Neva before her death the specific habit of documenting everything in writing at the time of its occurrence rather than reconstructing it from memory afterward, a habit Neva carried into adulthood and which would matter, in the months ahead, more than she could have anticipated. The combination of Silas's eye for what the ground actually said and Clara's insistence on writing it down immediately had produced in Neva a particular quality of attention that the people who knew her found either admirable or slightly exhausting depending on how much they had to conceal from someone paying that kind of attention. She had worked alongside her father as his unofficial field assistant for the better part of a decade before his health began declining, a period during which she developed, through simple accumulated practice, a competence in field survey work that exceeded what most formally employed surveyors in the territory brought to the same tasks, A competence she was careful never to display too prominently in contexts where its display might make the men she worked alongside uncomfortable. Understanding from practical experience that a woman's evident skill in a trade historically reserved for men tended to produce reactions that made the subsequent work harder rather than easier. She kept her abilities precise and her manner modest, and she found, across those years, a deep and genuine satisfaction in the field work itself that had nothing to do with anyone else's acknowledgement of it, the same satisfaction her father took in a correctly measured bearing, the specific, private pleasure of knowing that what you had recorded corresponded to what was actually there. It was during these same years that she became familiar, in the way of someone who has grown up alongside a subject without ever being formally taught it, with the particular history of Wyoming's early railroad surveys, the expansion years of the 1860s and 1870s during which survey teams had pushed into terrain that had never been formally mapped and had documented, sometimes hastily and sometimes under considerable duress, the routes that would eventually carry the territory's first iron rails. Her father had spoken of those early surveys with a respect that verged on reverence, describing the quality of attention they had required of their surveyors and the difficulty of the terrain they had worked through, and he had mentioned more than once, across the years, a particular survey crew from 1871 that had pushed into the territory's southwestern edge under a surveyor named Aldous Merritt and had returned with a route report that had subsequently been disputed, amended, and ultimately set aside in favor of a different alignment, the original survey effectively erased from the practical record. He had mentioned Merritt's crew with a particular kind of careful restraint that Neva had learned, over years of listening to her father, to recognize as the restraint of a man who has an opinion he has decided, for specific reasons, not to voice. The fall had come in the way that falls in that country so often did, arriving not as a single blow but as a sequence of smaller ones, each manageable alone and collectively devastating. Silas's decline had begun with a cough he attributed to a particularly cold survey season and had revealed itself, by the spring before his death, as something considerably more serious, a progressive weakness of the lungs that the Dunbar's Crossing physician described with the careful vagueness of a man communicating gravity without offering anything useful in exchange for it. They had returned to Dunbar's Crossing when it became clear that Silas could not continue field work, settling into the house on the property he had surveyed and filed on 20 years before, the 40 acres at the valley's northern edge that he had always spoken of as the foundation of whatever security he intended to leave his daughter. Neva had nursed him through that final winter with the same systematic, patient attention she brought to anything that required it, and she had been with him when he died in December, quietly and without apparent distress, in the particular way of men who have spent their lives doing honest work and have nothing at the end that needs settling. The property dispute had arrived, in the form of Prescott Hale and his territorial amendment documentation, within 6 weeks of the funeral. Neva had fought it as far as she could fight it without a lawyer and without the money a lawyer required, writing letters to the Territorial Land Office and to the Union Pacific's Records Division and to 2 survey firms in Cheyenne whose principals had known her father, and receiving from each a sympathetic response that offered nothing practical, the territorial amendment being, as each correspondent confirmed in their own careful language, technically valid in its application even if its practical effect was to absorb, into the trust's considerable holdings, the one piece of ground Silas Cade had specifically filed on for his daughter's security. By March she was out of the house and into the rented room and down to $9, and by early April she was at the general store counter listening to old Gideon Marsh talk about the trust's tax sale of a 4-mile railroad right-of-way that ended at the edge of the territory's official awareness. She walked the right-of-way for the first time the morning after she paid for it, carrying her father's satchel and her compass and the county's official map of the parcel, which showed, in the clean cartographic certainty of official documentation, a strip of land that ran 4 miles southwest from the last junction of the old Meridian spur line before ending at what the map labeled, with the particular confidence of documents that have stopped looking, as the survey terminus. The tracks themselves, or what remained of them, were overgrown to the point of near invisibility for the first 3 miles, rails corroded through in places and crossties rotted to almost nothing, the whole infrastructure returning gradually to the earth that had provided its material with the patient thoroughness of nature reclaiming what was temporarily lent. She walked the full 4 miles that first day, watching the track remains emerge and disappear through the vegetation, and stood at the official terminus, which was marked by nothing more than the absence of even the corroded rails that had accompanied her to that point, and understood immediately what any trained surveyor would have understood standing in the same place, that the terrain ahead showed no natural terminus, that the ground continued in exactly the same configuration it had maintained for the preceding mile, and that there was no landscape reason whatsoever for a survey line to have ended precisely where this one officially had. She camped at the terminus that night, having come prepared for the possibility, and walked beyond it the following morning with her compass and the field notebook she carried everywhere. Moving into country, the official maps showed as essentially blank, a designation that meant not empty but unrecorded, the cartographer's acknowledgement that what existed there had never been formally documented. The terrain was difficult but navigable, old-growth timber covering a series of rolling ridges that eventually opened, after 3 miles of careful progress through unmarked country, into a valley she had not known to expect and which was not, she understood immediately, entirely without human presence. The valley held a settlement, or more precisely the remains of a settlement, a cluster of stone and timber structures arranged along a creek with the purposeful geometry of genuine planning rather than the random distribution of temporary encampment, some partially collapsed and this was the part that stopped her walking and held her in place for a long, quiet moment, some still structurally sound, their doors closed and their windows intact and their condition suggesting not ancient abandonment but something considerably more recent and considerably more deliberate. She found the records in the largest of the sound structures, a building that had clearly served as some kind of administrative office, its interior still holding a work table and a set of shelving along one wall, the shelves still holding, wrapped in oilskin that had preserved them against the valley's considerable humidity, 3 bound ledgers and a rolled survey map and a sealed tin that contained, when she worked its lid free at her campfire that evening, a letter and a folded set of documents she recognized immediately as territorial land grant records of the formal type used in the 1870s. The letter was signed by Aldous Merritt, dated August of 1872, and addressed to the Union Pacific Railroad's territorial superintendent, and it described, in the careful professional language of a man trained to report exactly what he had found, the existence and nature of the valley settlement, which Merritt had encountered during his 1871 survey and which had been, at the time of his survey, an established community of perhaps 40 families, homesteaders who had arrived ahead of the formal territorial surveys and built their settlement in country the railroad had not yet assessed, filing informal claims of the type that territorial law allowed pending formal survey confirmation. What followed in Merritt's letter was the account that explained everything Neva had found confusing about the official record, the reason the 1871 survey had been disputed and set aside, the reason the tracks on the spur line had stopped precisely where they had stopped, and the reason the settlement in the valley appeared on no official map despite having existed for years before the railroad's arrival. Merritt had surveyed the valley and confirmed the homesteaders' informal claims as valid under territorial law, and had recommended in his official report that the railroad's route be aligned to serve rather than displace the existing settlement. The Union Pacific's territorial superintendent at the time, a man named Cassius Vane whose descendants Neva would later confirm still held, through the Meridian Valley Land Trust, the largest property portfolio in the county, had responded by suppressing Merritt's survey, commissioning a replacement survey that simply omitted the valley entirely, and arranging for the homesteaders to be told, through county officials whose cooperation Vane had secured through means Merritt's letter suggested, but did not specify, that their informal claims had been invalidated by the formal survey, their land absorbed into the railroad's right-of-way grant, and their presence on it therefore unlawful. The families had left, Merritt wrote, which was to say they had been made to leave, and their departure had been so thoroughly managed, and the suppression of his survey so effectively executed, that within a year there was no official record of either the survey or the settlement, and within a decade there was apparently no practical memory of either among the people who had arranged the suppression, only the land itself, holding in its stone-walled structures and its 3 decades of patient waiting the evidence of what had actually happened there. The 3 ledgers held the homesteaders' own records, careful documentation of their claims and their improvements and the names and origins of their families, kept by a settlement clerk whose handwriting grew, across the ledger's final entries, increasingly urgent without losing its underlying precision, the handwriting of a person who understood that the record they were keeping might be the only proof that any of this had existed at all. Neva spent 2 more days in the valley, mapping it with her father's instruments and copying every significant entry from the 3 ledgers into her own field notebook, Understanding that what she held was not merely the documentation of a historical wrong but the specific evidence needed to demonstrate that the Meridian Valley Land Trust's title to its most valuable holdings rested on the same suppressed survey that had displaced 40 families from land they had lawfully settled. She understood with equal clarity that the people most immediately threatened by this evidence were the same people who had already, through Prescott Hale's careful management of the territorial amendment, relieved her of the 40 acres her father had spent 20 years building toward, and that they would become aware of what she had found long before she was ready for them to be, because small territories, like small towns, could not sustain many secrets simultaneously, and she had been walking through country adjacent to the Trust's holdings for 3 days and had spoken to 2 of the Trust's ranch hands at a creek crossing who had noted her presence with the specific alertness of men employed to notice who moved through land their employer considered his own. Prescott Hale arrived at her rented room on the 4th morning after her return to Dunbar's Crossing, which was faster than she had expected, and told her that the ranch hand's report had reached him the previous evening rather than the following morning, which meant someone in the valley's surrounding country had been watching for exactly this kind of movement more carefully than a casual concern for trespass would explain. Hale was a composed man of perhaps 50 whose courtesy had the quality of a tool used so frequently it had become habitual, and he made his offer in the same measured cadences she had heard from Gerald Fitch's type before, framing a substantial sum as a reasonable resolution of an unfortunate situation and requiring in return the field notes she had kept during her survey and whatever documents she had removed from the valley settlement. She listened to the full offer in the same silence she brought to any piece of ground she was trying to understand, and when he finished she told him, with the same level precision she used to report a bearing, that she had not removed any documents from the valley and that her field notes were her own professional work product, and that she would be happy to discuss the matter further once she had had the opportunity to review the Territorial Land Office's records regarding the 1871 Merit Survey. Hale's courtesy did not break, but it cooled, precisely and visibly, and he left with the specific controlled composure of a man who has just understood that a situation he believed to be manageable is marginally less so than he had arrived believing. The days that followed required a quality of patience she drew on her father's memory to sustain, since the pressure that Hale brought to bear was not dramatic but sustained and comprehensive, a steady narrowing of practical options that expressed itself as a landlord's sudden recollection of an overdue rent arrangement and a mercantile's discovery of an accounting irregularity in her modest credit account and a general store's inexplicable inability to fill the supply orders she had placed in advance of a second valley visit she was planning. She documented each instance in her field notebook with the same dated, factual precision she brought to any survey finding, understanding that a record of pressure applied was itself a form of evidence in a case that was, at its root, about what happened when power decided that the official record should say something different from what actually occurred. She wrote, during those same days, 3 letters, one to the Territorial Surveyor General's office in Cheyenne, enclosing a summary of the Merit Survey's suppression with specific reference to the documentary evidence she had located, one to a law firm in Denver whose senior partner had known her father through the survey firm network and who specialized in territorial land disputes, and one to a correspondent at the Cheyenne Daily Leader whose coverage of territorial land matters she had followed with attention since she was old enough to understand their significance. The Territorial Surveyor General's response arrived within 10 days, which was faster than she had expected and suggested that the Merit Survey's suppression was not entirely unknown to the current office, existing perhaps as an institutional unease rather than a specific documented suspicion, a discomfort looking for the evidentiary basis to become something more formal. The Denver law firm's response arrived 2 weeks after that, its senior partner agreeing to take her case on the strength of the documentary summary she had provided, and the journalist's response arrived simultaneously with a request to travel to Dunbar's Crossing for a direct interview, a request Neva agreed to with the understanding that her account would be given only once she and her attorney had the full documentary record in proper order. It took 4 months of careful, methodical work, the same 4 months during which Prescott Hale's pressures grew increasingly less subtle and the Trust's attorneys filed 2 procedural challenges in the Territorial Land Court that her Denver attorney addressed with the efficient precision of someone who had encountered exactly these techniques before and had developed reliable responses, to assemble the complete case from Merit's letter and the settlement ledgers and Neva's own field documentation and the Territorial Surveyor General's independent confirmation that the survey files from 1871 showed evidence of subsequent alteration inconsistent with normal administrative revision. The formal hearing before the Territorial Land Commissioner in September of 1902 lasted 2 days, and at its conclusion the Commissioner issued a finding that the Meridian Valley Land Trust's title to its core holdings was defective at its origin, the founding grants having been obtained through the suppression of a prior survey that would, if properly filed, have established conflicting rights requiring adjudication before any grant could have been issued. The subsequent process was neither swift nor simple, because the law's relationship to a fraud embedded in the title chain of property held across 30 years by multiple successive parties in apparent good faith was exactly as complicated as that description suggested, and because Prescott Hale's firm was capable and well-resourced and contested every finding with the thoroughness that substantial financial stakes warranted. But the process moved, and it moved in one direction, and what it produced across the following 2 years was a negotiated settlement that returned to the documented descendants of the 40 displaced families a portion of the valley's value in the form of a territorial compensation fund administered independently of the trust, along with the formal entry into the official survey record of Aldous Merritt's 1871 survey as a corrected filing, restoring to the permanent documentary history of Wyoming Territory the existence of the Valley Settlement and the names of its founding families, which had been absent from that record for 30 years. Neva returned the settlement's ledgers to the Territorial Archive rather than keeping them, and she kept for herself only Aldous Merritt's letter, framed on the wall of the surveying practice she established in Dunbar's Crossing once the case's resolution restored to her the practical standing in the Territory's professional community that the Trust's pressure had been designed to remove. She established the practice under her own name, the first formally licensed female surveyor in Dunbar's Crossing's history, licensed by a territorial board whose members found, when the case's conclusion had clarified the cost of ignoring qualified women's professional applications, that their previous resistance had become considerably more expensive to maintain than to abandon. We come back, at the end of every story, to the beginning, because the beginning is where a thing's true nature first becomes visible, before the complexity of what followed has had a chance to make it seem inevitable. Neva Cade had walked to the end of a forgotten railroad track in the Wyoming spring with $9 in her pocket and a dead father's compass in her hand and no clear understanding of why she was following tracks that the official map said led nowhere, except the same quality of attention her father had spent her whole childhood teaching her to bring to any ground whose surface and whose official description did not fully correspond, the attention that noticed what was actually there rather than what was supposed to be there. That attention had followed the tracks beyond their official end because the ground beyond the end gave no landscape reason for the tracks to have stopped there, and it had found, 3 miles further than the maps acknowledged, a valley full of stone walls and 30 years of waiting and 3 ledgers that had spent all those years keeping the record that the people who displaced their authors had been very careful to ensure was kept by no one else. She had not known, paying $7 for a strip of abandoned railroad right-of-way, that what she was actually purchasing was the specific ground she needed to walk to find what had been hidden from the record. She had known only that the ground didn't match the map, and that when the ground and the map disagreed, in her father's philosophy and therefore in her own, it was always the ground that was telling the truth. Neva Cade, who had once stood in Dunbar's Crossing with $9 and a surveying kit that no firm in town would hire and a compass that pointed honestly in every direction she was afraid to take, became within 3 years the territory's most trusted land surveyor, not because fortune decided to favor her but because she had refused to let a foreclosure notice, a suppressed survey, or 4 months of systematic pressure keep her from following a set of tracks past the point where every official document said there was nothing left to follow. She kept her father's compass on her work table, not as a memorial but as an accurate description of the instrument she had always found most useful in difficult country, the one that pointed toward what was actually there regardless of what anyone with an interest in a different direction preferred it to say. Thank you for spending this time with us tonight and with Neva and with the tracks that stopped where someone needed them to stop and started again, 3 miles later, where they had always been meant to go. If this story moved you, we would be grateful if you shared it with someone who needs to be reminded that the map is not always the territory, and that what someone has decided to leave off the record is sometimes exactly what the record most needs. And we would love to know, what is a time you followed something past the point where everyone else had turned back, and found that what was waiting beyond that point was the whole reason you had started walking? Tell us in the comments below. We read every single one, and we mean that. Until next time, stay close.